So you're basically explaining to the audience that the old colonialism of the English Empire through the United States of America is pushing further and more far by the insiders that are linked to the old English heritage. They push America in the wrong direction to extend the legacy of the old British Empire, the traditional colonialism of English.
Oh, that's absolutely right. And you see it economically with the United States, Treasury officials and others, the total supporters of the International Monetary Fund, which functions as a kind of coordinating center for a global bankers dictatorship. You see it in the role today of people like Mark Carney, the chairman of the Bank of England, who's at the center of trying to organize a new financial system with a weaker dollar and a weak US. But yeah, this has been the conflict. And you see it also in the debate over such things as what should we do with Ukraine? What should we do with Syria? And, you know, as you and I were talking about before, you can see very clearly that the US and the British, and by US now I'm talking about the intelligence community, the State Department, worked together with the British on regime change in Libya. And of course, the French played a role in that, Syria, Ukraine, and so on. And what's interesting to me, and it's worth noting, is that in the US military, particularly in the Army, you have people who are allied with Trump's view, people who have seen war, who don't want to be in wars. They're not paperclip generals or chicken hawks like the Dick Cheney types, but they were in Iraq and they don't want war. They want the US to pull out of these wars. And who's supporting the wars? Virtually every single person in the Democratic and Republican Party, because they're steeped in this British geopolitics, the idea that you have to have an enemy image. And this goes back, and I think it's important that Trump has used this term recently, it goes back to Eisenhower's discussion of the military-industrial complex, which is not just the military or the defense contractors, but the consultants and the so-called democracy builders and the think tanks and the economists who believe in this idea today of American unilateralism. This is the American version of the British Empire, the Project for a New American Century, so-called PNAC, that came at the end of the communist era, came along and said, this is the end of history. American liberal democracy has prevailed. This is the only system that will be allowed anymore, and anyone who goes against it will pay the price. And look at Gaddafi, look at Saddam Hussein, look at what they tried to do to Assad, look at the vicious attacks on Putin, and now as well in the United States on President Xi of China, because they don't go along with the International Monetary Fund and the City of London, Wall Street global policy.
I get the point, but once you talk about the English influence behind, there is obviously you cannot miss the Israelis'
of course not.
interest, because the Rothschild took the economy since this Napoleon defeat, where he took the economy of the English. Since this time, there is a really close movement between the English economy and the Jewish pro-Israeli economy. So behind what you are denouncing with the British, we cannot avoid the role of the Israeli interests that are pushing in this direction, because obviously it is their interest to do such.
Well, some people have the mistaken view that it's the Israelis that are the controllers in this, but you have to just go back to 1900 and look at the emergence around Lloyd George of what was called the British Israelites. These were not Jewish people. These were people who wanted to use the so-called Holy Land to make sure there would never be a bridge between Asia, Europe, and Africa. That's what geopolitics is about. The idea of land bridges, whether it's the Trans-Siberian Railroad or Berlin to Baghdad Railroad, that threatened British control of the seas. And so what they did from 1900 to 1916 was prepare for the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. And one of the things they did was they came up with this artificial idea called Zionism, the idea that Jews want to return to the Holy Land. Now, I come from an Eastern European Jewish background. My grandparents didn't want to go to Jerusalem or Israel. They came to Brooklyn, New York. And a large number of Jews migrated from the terrible conditions in Russia and Poland with pogroms and so on to the United States. Or as LaRouche once put it in a very interesting way, if a Jewish tailor in Minsk wanted to get sand up his butt, he'd go to Miami Beach instead of Tel Aviv. Now, the Balfour Declaration was the British sanctioning of creating a so-called Jewish homeland. But it wasn't possible until they rounded up the refugees from the end of World War II and shipped them to Israel and made this a cause internationally. Now, I would argue that in many cases, the Israelis have served as among the more important allies of this British Empire. And there was always a fight. Look, to go back to Eisenhower and this idea of the military-industrial complex, in 1956, the Israelis, in coordination with France and Britain, invaded Suez. They were going to knock out Nasser. And Eisenhower told the British, get the hell out, or we're going to put sanctions on you. Because he did not want a war, a confrontation between East and West over in support of Israel. It was at that point that the Israelis escalated their efforts to get nuclear technology from the French. And I would argue that the French have played a pretty dirty role as sidekicks in this Anglo-American empire. But that you're absolutely right in describing it as a new form of colonialism, where you use banker policy, conditionality policies of the International Monetary Fund, and then false flags in the form of terrorism, many of which were trained and created initially by the British and then by the CIA. So we're dealing with the legacy of a couple hundred years of British imperial policy. And unfortunately, with very few exceptions, this is what's taught as history in the United States. This is what's taught in economic policy, strategic policy. I mean, I just did a talk at a major conference on the difference between John Locke and the American Founding Fathers. The American Founding Fathers rejected Locke, and yet today you'll find everyone praising John Locke as the father of the Constitution. So there's been a brainwashing operation run by the City of London, top down through the universities, and I see the same thing in France.